Act 1. The Phantom Bomber. The late 1970s in America were a time of deep-seated cynicism. The wounds of the Vietnam War were still fresh, and the Watergate scandal had shattered the nation's trust in its own government. It was also an era of rapid technological advancement. The first personal computers were appearing in homes, air travel was becoming commonplace, and universities were the epicenters of a new, complex, and sometimes intimidating technological world. It was against this backdrop of progress and paranoia that a new kind of terror began. A terror that arrived in the mail. The story begins not with a bang, but with a simple, suspicious package. In May of 1978, at the University of Illinois at Chicago, a parcel was found that was addressed to a professor but had been returned to sender. The return address, however, was from a different professor at Northwestern University who claimed he had never sent it. Confused, campus security was called. As a security officer opened the package, it exploded. He was injured, but not seriously. The incident was initially dismissed as a bizarre, isolated act, perhaps the work of a disgruntled student. No one knew it was the first move from a man who would become America's most wanted domestic terrorist. Almost exactly a year later, in May 1979, a graduate student at Northwestern University was injured when he opened a similar package, this one designed to look like a book. The police now suspected a connection, but the evidence was scant. The bombs were incredibly well-crafted, made from scrap wood and metal parts, almost like pieces of dark, homemade art. They left behind almost no forensic clues. Then, in November of 1979, the bomber escalated his campaign from academia to the public at large, and the full scale of his ambition became terrifyingly clear. A bomb was placed in the cargo hold of American Airlines Flight 444, a Boeing 727 flying from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The bomb was equipped with a barometric trigger, designed to detonate as the plane reached a certain altitude. Miraculously, the device malfunctioned. It began to produce a large amount of smoke, forcing the pilots to make an emergency landing. The bomb did not fully detonate. If it had, it would have blown a hole in the fuselage, and all 72 people on board would have perished. This attack changed everything. A plot to bring down a commercial airliner was a federal crime of the highest order. The FBI took over the investigation, creating a massive task force to hunt the mysterious bomber. Based on his targets, they gave the case a simple bureaucratic name: Unabomber, for university and airline bomber. The press would soon latch onto this name, and the phantom attacker would become known to the world as the Unabomber. The FBI was now hunting a meticulous, patient, and brilliant killer, a ghost who could build untraceable weapons and strike anywhere in the country. A man who held a deep and murderous grudge against the modern world itself. Act 2. A Ghost in the Machine. For several years after the failed airline bombing, the case went eerily quiet. The Unabomber seemed to have vanished, and the FBI's massive investigation had little to go on. They were hunting a ghost, a killer whose only signature was his meticulous, untraceable craftsmanship. The bombs were complex, yet made from common scrap materials that could be found in any garage or workshop, making them impossible to trace back to a source. Then, in the mid-1980s, the ghost returned, and this time, his attacks were more frequent and far more deadly. The targets remained the same: universities and symbols of technology. But the bombs were now more powerful, designed not just to injure, but to kill. A professor at UC Berkeley, and a graduate student at the University of Michigan were severely maimed by the new, more sophisticated devices. The phantom bomber was refining his deadly craft. The case crossed a dark threshold on December 11, 1985, in Sacramento, California. Hugh Scruton, the 38-year-old owner of a computer rental store, noticed a strange block of wood in his parking lot. When he picked it up, it exploded. The device, packed with nails and shrapnel, killed him instantly. The Unabomber was no longer just a menace. He was now a murderer. With the body count rising and no physical evidence to follow, the FBI turned to a new and developing field: criminal profiling. They brought in their best behavioral analysts to build a psychological portrait of the killer. The profile they created was remarkably prescient. They concluded the Unabomber was a highly intelligent man with a university education, likely in the hard sciences. He was an antisocial recluse, a meticulous planner who was comfortable working with his hands. And he was driven by a deep personal and violent rage against modern technology. The profile was a brilliant piece of psychological detective work, but it was still just a ghost story. It described a type of person, but it didn't provide a name or a face. The only tangible clue came from the bombs themselves. Etched into some of the metal components, investigators found the tiny initials FC. For the first time, the killer had given his phantom organization a name. The FBI had no idea what FC stood for, but they now knew they weren't just hunting a madman. They were hunting a terrorist with a cause. Act 3. The Manifesto. After the first fatality in 1985, the Unabomber's attacks became more sporadic, but also more lethal. He would go silent for years at a time, lulling the nation into a false sense of security, only to re-emerge with another deadly device. In the 1990s, he struck twice more, killing an advertising executive named Thomas Mosser in 1994 and a timber industry lobbyist, Gilbert Murray, in 1995. The FBI's investigation, now in its second decade, was the longest and most expensive in its history, and they were no closer to finding their man. Then, in 1995, after the Murray bombing, the Unabomber made his boldest and most arrogant move yet. He sent letters to the New York Times and the Washington Post, two of the most respected newspapers in the world. In the letters, the group calling itself FC made a stunning demand. They had written a 35,000-word essay titled Industrial Society and Its Future, and they demanded that the newspapers publish it in its entirety. If they complied, the bombings would stop. If they refused, he would blow up another airliner. The FBI was now faced with an unprecedented and terrifying dilemma. Should they give in to the demands of a terrorist? Would publishing his manifesto turn him into a folk hero and inspire copycat killers? Or was this their one and only chance to catch him? The Unabomber had remained a ghost for 17 years, leaving no clues. The manifesto, the profilers argued, was the first real window into his mind. They believed his unique writing style, his specific philosophical arguments, and his turns of phrase were so idiosyncratic that someone somewhere had to recognize them. After intense and secret debate between the FBI, the Attorney General, and the publishers of the two newspapers, they made a decision that was a massive gamble. They agreed to the terrorists' demand. In September of 1995, the Washington Post, with financial assistance from the New York Times, published Industrial Society and Its Future as a special supplement. For the first time, the entire nation could read the dense, rambling, and often brilliant critique of modern society, written by a serial killer. The FBI held its breath, hoping that their long shot, their last desperate gambit, would finally pay off. They were hoping that somewhere in America, a person reading the paper would have a chilling moment of recognition. Act 4. A brother's suspicion. The FBI's gamble paid off in a way no one could have predicted. In Schenectady, New York, a social worker named Linda Patrick read excerpts of the Manifesto and was struck by a chilling feeling of familiarity. The strange, anti-technology ideas and the unique writing style reminded her of her reclusive and brilliant brother-in-law. She urged her husband, David Kaczynski, to read it. David was hesitant at first. He loved his older brother, Ted, despite their estrangement. But as he read the Manifesto's words, a dreadful suspicion began to form. The specific phrases, the intellectual arrogance, the intense rage against modern society. It was all unmistakably the voice of his brother. David and Linda were now faced with an agonizing and almost unbearable dilemma. Did they harbor a terrible suspicion and risk more people dying? Or did they turn in their own family member, potentially sending him to his death and bringing unimaginable pain upon their family? After weeks of soul-searching, David located old letters that Ted had sent him over the years. He and Linda sat at their kitchen table, comparing the typewritten letters to the text of the Manifesto. The similarities were overwhelming and undeniable. The same unusual turns of phrase, the same specific philosophical arguments, and even the same typographical quirks were present in both. There was no longer any doubt in their minds. In early 1996, David Kaczynski, through a lawyer, made the bravest and most difficult decision of his life. He contacted the FBI and told them he believed his brother, Theodore John Kaczynski, was the Unabomber. For the FBI, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for 17 long years. They compared Ted's letters with the Manifesto, and forensic linguists confirmed the match. After chasing a phantom for nearly 2 decades, they finally had a name. Their psychological profile of a brilliant but reclusive academic was a perfect fit. Ted Kaczynski was a Harvard-educated mathematics prodigy who had abandoned a promising academic career to live as a hermit, completely off the grid. The ghost finally had a face. Act 5. Act 5. The Cabin in the Woods. The FBI now had their suspect, but they had to move carefully. After 17 years of failures, they could not afford to make a mistake. They began a covert surveillance operation, cross-referencing everything they knew about Ted Kaczynski with the Unabomber case file. The pieces fit perfectly. Kaczynski had been living in or near the locations of several of the bombings at the times they occurred. His academic background matched the profile, and most importantly, his known writings were a near-perfect match for the Manifesto. Their investigation led them to a tiny, isolated 10 by 12-foot cabin, deep in the woods of rural Montana. This was where the brilliant Harvard-educated mathematician had been living for years, completely off the grid, with no electricity or running water. He was a hermit, a ghost living in self-imposed exile from the very technological society he despised. On April 3, 1996, a team of FBI agents, disguised as Forest Service workers and property surveyors, surrounded the remote cabin. They approached cautiously, unsure of what they would find. They knocked on the door, and a thin, bearded, and disheveled man emerged, Theodore John Kaczynski. He was arrested without a struggle. The longest and most expensive manhunt in FBI history was finally over. Inside the tiny, cluttered cabin, Investigators found a treasure trove of evidence that definitively linked Kaczynski to the bombings. It was a complete bomb-making factory in miniature. They found bomb components, detailed diagrams, and chemistry textbooks. They discovered a live, fully assembled bomb, ready to be mailed. And in a small box, they found the two most crucial pieces of evidence. The first was the original, typewritten manuscript of industrial society and its future. The Manifesto that had been his greatest act of hubris and his ultimate downfall. The second was a personal journal, a 10,000-page diary in which Kaczynski had meticulously documented, in chilling and emotionless detail, his 2-decade-long campaign of terror, his hatred for society, and his experiments in building bombs. The ghost who had haunted the nation for 17 years had left behind a complete confession. Act 6. The Mind of a Killer. The trial of Theodore Kaczynski was set to be a media sensation, but it took a strange and unexpected turn. His court-appointed lawyers planned to save him from the death penalty by arguing that he was mentally ill. A paranoid schizophrenic whose manifesto was the product of a diseased mind. But Kaczynski fiercely rejected this strategy. He was not, in his own view, a madman. He was a revolutionary, a philosopher who had committed necessary acts of violence to protest the evils of industrial society. To be labeled as mentally ill would be to invalidate his entire life's work. He fought bitterly with his lawyers, even attempting to fire them and represent himself. To avoid a chaotic public trial where Kaczynski could use the courtroom as a stage for his anti-technology crusade, federal prosecutors offered a plea deal. In January 1998, Ted Kaczynski pleaded guilty to all federal charges. In exchange, he was spared the death penalty and sentenced to 8 life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. The Unabomber's reign of terror was over, but the questions about his mind and motives would endure. He was a certified genius with an IQ of 167, a mathematics prodigy who had entered Harvard at the age of 16. But his time there was marked by social isolation and his participation in a controversial and psychologically brutal study, which many believe contributed to his later hatred of authority and the system. He was not a simple, bloodthirsty killer. He was a domestic terrorist with a complex, coherent, and deeply disturbing ideology. His manifesto, Industrial Society and Its Future, remains a chillingly relevant critique of modern technology, read and debated to this day. Ted Kaczynski died in federal prison in 2023, leaving behind a dark legacy. He was a modern monster, a man whose brilliance curdled into a cold, murderous rage, a ghost in the machine who, for 17 years, held a nation in fear. What do you think of the Unabomber's philosophy? Was he a madman or a revolutionary? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And for more deep dives into the minds of history's most complex criminals, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Dark Cell Stories.